Yeah, I've got you, and I'm going to go live now.
Okay, cool.
Hello and welcome to RIOT Science Club Imperial. Thank you everybody for joining us. As you know, the RIOT Science Club was set up by Dr. Sam Westwood to raise an awareness and provide training in reproducible, interpretable, open and transparent science practices. It's gone from strength to strength, and the club now has thousands of followers, and there are RIOT clubs at 6 different institutions. We're growing at what feels like a really fast pace, almost week by week, and Norway have just launched their own group. So one of the advantages of COVID and changes to our working practices is that we can be global, and time zones permitting, people can tune in from anywhere. But when we do go back to more face-to-face activities, my aim will be to host more local events and build a network at Imperial, similar to the networks that exist at other institutions. So give us a follow on Twitter, sign up for email alerts so that you don't miss out, and all previous speakers and events are shared on the RIOT Club OSF page and YouTube channel. So a bit of housekeeping before I introduce our next speaker. All our events on MS Team Live Events, which generates a publicly accessible link so anyone can join, and you can share this link publicly. Live Events is a one-way streaming platform, and you can ask your questions via the Q&A message board, and these will be moderated by myself. Please keep your comments and questions relevant and respectful, and questions will be fed to the speaker at the end of their talk. I'll monitor the Q&A board, and please monitor it as well, and upvote any questions that you would like to be asked, and I'll prioritise the most popular. Finally, if you join late, don't worry, you can pause, rewind, fast forward, and Live Events also has an auto subtitling feature too, and I've enabled several languages. So on to our main event. This person doesn't need very much of an introduction from me. He's a Royal Society Christmas Lecture fame, he's Campton Volcanoes, recently a guest judge on the Great British Menu. And so today we're very honoured to welcome Professor Chris Jackson with us. He is Chair in Sustainable Geoscience at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Manchester. There isn't a week or a day, I don't suppose, that goes by in academia where we're not discussing researcher and research assessment. So today's Chris talk will discuss what tools we use, whether they're fair, do they get us the desired result, although what is the desired result, and the roles that preprints play in this, and in more generally creating an open and progressive research culture. So I won't rabbit on anymore, and I hand over to Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadia, and yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to give a talk today on something which I didn't used to know a lot about, and I still don't really, but I'm enjoying learning about this alongside learning about all the scientific stuff I have formal training in. So just to start off, we're in a rental property, so actually the house owner is selling the house, so there's actually somebody in cleaning the house for the owner. So if you can hear any noise in the background, it's just because there's some cleaning going on here. So if it gets too bad, I'll have to move. But yeah, so thank you everybody for joining me. This is who I am, and I think this is relevant to the talk today. You know, I'm a geologist. I'm based at the University of Manchester, having done my BSc and PhD there before going into industry for a number of years at Statoil in Norway. Worked at Imperial College for about 16.5 years before recently moving to the University of Manchester. This is me in the top right, not here on the left. This is relevant to the talk today. You know, I've published quite a lot of papers, so I have a lot of experience from the author side and in terms of training and working with early career researchers. So, you know, a few hundred papers that I'm involved in. So I've kind of looked at it from that side. Then also I've been editor for about 6 journals or so. So I've seen it from the editorial side and from the publisher side, and I also was involved in setting up one preprint server, so I'll talk about that towards the end of the talk. But this is all to give you a health warning that this is not my area of expertise. It's like when people ask scientists to go and talk about race and racial justice, you really want to go and speak to people who specialise in that, sociologists, psychologists, people who are aware of the social sciences. But you know, as scientists, we're increasingly drawn into this discussion and battle at times, it feels like, to talk about things which are not immediately in our area of expertise. So this talk comes with a health warning that I'm a geologist, not a bibliometrician, for example, and I'm not a psychologist either to understand how these things impact at the individual or group level. So, but all those warnings notwithstanding, I still want to tell you a little bit about what I've learned during my academic career in terms of publishing and related matters. So, you know, there's a lot of us, right? There's lots of scientists. This photograph's from the AGU4 meeting a few years ago, and there's lots of us, right? And everybody wants a slice of the pie. All these people at this conference showing their posters off either want to get jobs, sometimes in academia, sometimes outside of academia, and some of these people who are already in academia probably want to get promoted through their academic activities. And, you know, so promotion and hiring are two of the key concerns for us. How do we do that? Well, one thing we have to do is measure ourselves, okay? We need to measure ourselves and we need to measure other people. And there's two ways we typically do this when we consider publishing. One is through using something called the journal impact factor. So we try and relate the quality of the work and the researcher produced it to the impact factor of the journal. I will go on to this in a moment, what this means. And another way is through using something called the H index, and that's another measure to do with the number of times your work's been cited. And again, I'll go through this a bit in detail. But these are the two metrics I'm really going to kind of discuss mostly during the first kind of 2/3 of this talk. So the impact factor, right? It's kind of this monolithic thing is pictured here, which looms over all of our actions, okay? What field we might go into work on and where we choose to publish a piece of work that arises from some research. And it's kind of pervasive, and it's pervasive to this level as shown here, right? You go onto a journal website and one of the first things you see after the title of the let's go to laser pointer, after the title of the journal is the editors, and then you see the impact factor. So even more important than what this journal is about, what its scope is the impact factor. And you can see that on a number of different geoscience journals here. So, you know, that goes some way to showing why it is this monolithic thing, which is by the publishers and by the authors seen as being possibly the most important thing about journal-based publications. So what does the journal impact factor actually mean? The reason I included this slide is because I did a straw poll before I left Imperial College a couple of years ago now and asked people in our department, academics, of which I think I talked about 40 people, how many of them knew what the impact factor was, and only about 45% of them actually knew correctly how it was calculated, which is curious given that it drives so many of our decisions and influences our behaviour so strongly. So the impact factor is this. It's the number of citations divided by the total number of articles calculated over a specific period of time. So typically calculated over 2 years as shown in the last slide, but often shown as being over 5 years. Often if the journal has a better 5-year impact factor than a 2-year impact factor journal, you'll see them showing both. So let's take a worked example here at the bottom. So let's look at the journal impact factor for a journal in 2014. That's based on the total number of items published in the preceding 2 years. So 2012 and 2013 is 181. And if you look then at the number of, that's the number of citations to those articles. And here's the number of articles published is 40. So you take 181 divided by 40 and that yields an impact factor of 4.5 for that specific journal. Now, if we look at Nature, so like one of the flagship journals, and we look at this idea, because obviously based on what I showed in the previous slide, what we're looking at there is the mean. And what is possibly more useful, so, you know, there's the 2-year impact factor, which is the means. I might actually move because it's a little bit squeaky here. Nadia, is it, can you hear that? Just to check.
Yeah, we can hear it, but it isn't, it's not obscuring your speech, or we can hear you still very clearly.
Okay. I'll stick with it, I think. Actually, I might move because it might.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Okay, is that better now? And you can still see the presentation.
Sounds quieter now.
And you can still see the presentation.
question. Yeah. Hopefully somebody in the audience can, I don't know if you can take yourself off mute, maybe not. We continue. So here we have three of the Nature journals, Nature, Nature Communications and SciRep. We have the tier impact factor, which are the mean. But if you actually go to the medians are significantly lower than the means. And why is that? And that's because we are actually trying to plot against very skewed distributions in terms of citations to the items published. So as you can see in here for Nature, a highly skewed distribution, okay? You can see that there's one article here or a couple of articles which are driving the mean because they are accumulating or have accumulated a lot of citations in that time. So you can see here the median lies in the red arrow some distance below the mean, which is in the green in here. So what does this say, right? This says that, you know, you get published in this journal with a given impact factor, but it's likely that your paper lies somewhere within here, in this area where we have the bulge in the distribution. So your paper, in fact, hasn't really been cited that many times in the preceding 2 years, but you know, that's how you would sell the paper. And I've often asked early career researchers, in a way, what would they prefer? Would they prefer to have a paper which is never cited in a high impact factor journal, or a paper which is widely cited and considered influential in a low impact factor journal? And they are questions which we can probably return to in the Q&A. We often view then the journal impact factor as being some sort of measure of the quality of the work and therefore the influence of the work, and citation metrics being one measure of the influence. But as we can see here from this study in 1997, for 4 different researchers, with the x-axis being the impact factor of the journal and the y-axis being the citations per article per year, we can see it looks like a shotgun blast, okay? There's data points everywhere. There's a huge amount of scatter. So there's clearly, for these 4 researchers working in 4 different research areas, there is no correlation between the impact factor of the journal in which they're publishing and the number of citations that those papers have accumulated, and therefore what the community, the citation community, is considering the worth or value of that piece of work. And I'm not saying that citation rate or citation metrics are the measure of an individual piece of work, but I'm just saying that, you know, and I'll show you some of my own data later on related to this, but it is quite a complex thing. So as concluded by these authors, or this author, the authors do not necessarily publish their most citable work in journals with the highest impact factor, nor do their articles necessarily match the impact factor of the journals they appear in. This is kind of a true story, which is a bit of a horror show related to a proposal I put in a few years ago to a research council overseas. And one of the collaborators, the co-authors on the project, wrote this in his publication statement. I'm not going to read it out in detail, but basically he said, I've got 81 referee papers. They've been cited 3,700 times, an average of 46 citations per paper, but my H index is 31. And 10 of these papers have been cited more than 100 times. And it's a complete metric.
Sorry to interrupt you. You've become a bit muffled. I don't know if it's your headset. You might need to reconnect or...
Yeah, just 1 second. Right, let me try again. Is that any better?
You sound clearer to me now, yes.
Okay, great.
I don't know if it'd be better if you started at the top of the slide, because I couldn't quite hear everything.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a true horror story from a proposal I was involved in with an overseas co-I, and in the publication section there was this real horror show. So 81 referee papers, they said, cited 3,700 times, an average of 46 citations per paper, H index of 31, 10 papers cited more than 100 times and 11 more than 50 times. And it's this horrendous sort of like metric salad, if you will, using numbers to try and impress upon the panel their worth by numbers. It got worse than that though, because then they provided a list of all of the journals they published in, and they actually listed them by impact factor, as you can see see Nature at the top, tectonophysics at the bottom with the impact factor in brackets after them. And for the Nature paper, they even said, I have one paper in Nature and one accepted for review. So they're desperately saying, look, you know, even though this paper is likely to get rejected from Nature, still the editors at Nature think I'm good because they deign to, you know, allow one of my papers to go out for review. And so, you know, kind of contracting out your value and the relevance of your work to the proposal at hand to impact factors. And just to conclude this story, you know, there was another statement made in here where the COI had published in a relatively low impact factor journal, which was a relatively local one called the Canadian Journal of Earth Sciences. And they went to great pains to say that these were mandatory contributions and special issues that arose from a research project. Now, this research project was an incredibly prestigious one, but one of the requirements of that research project was that the people published the arising results in this specific journal. So the COI here is apologising for publishing in a low impact factor journal because they were made to. So, you know, there's a kind of odd contrast there in that, you know, clearly the fact they won this research proposal and went and did some significant work with it wasn't enough. They then had to make an excuse as to why that wasn't confirmed by the impact factor of the journal that those results were published in. And, you know, it was just one of the saddest things I think I've seen in my 17 years in academia. You know, this is a cause of much consternation amongst researchers at large, and especially early career researchers. This is John Tregoning, who was who's a lecturer at Imperial College, used to work with me, and he wrote this piece in Nature where he said, you know, how will people judge me if not by my impact factor? And you know, and John's point was that we're continuously told that metrics and impact factor are really important, but it's an arbitrary value, and we know that it's statistically flawed. But what else are we going to use? You know. And you know, his points here are that no alternative has emerged to displace the impact factor. Now, you know, there was a huge exchange on Twitter, principally in summer 2018, around this, in that, you know, using problematic and statistically flawed measures, we should still criticise them, even if we don't really know what a better method would be. And I think there's lots of other better methods. It's just to say, you know, I think we need to do better at communicating to people the issues with some of these metrics from a very early career point of view. So moving on to the H-index now. So the H-index is a slightly different beast. It still relates to the number of citations, but it's the number of citations to a certain number of papers by an individual author. So let's take this hypothetical case here where this author's published, let's say, 10 papers. 7 of those papers have accumulated 7 or more citations, as you can see in the right-hand column, and that yields a H-index of 7. This is how it's typically portrayed on things like Google Scholar. You know, we have citations in total, and then citations since 2014. H-index is given here in this middle row, and then we can see a distribution of citations through time, which can show increasing or diminishing number of citations, which some people would like to relate to an increasing or diminishing influence on the field, but I think that's not right. And just a warning then about these two metrics. So we've got these things at our disposal. They're statistically relatively easy to understand how they're calculated. Bearing in mind, you know, they were never created. Well, it's certainly in the Journal Impact Factor case, it wasn't created to measure researchers. Remember, the Journal Impact Factor was created to allow library staff to work out which journals to subscribe to. So why do we need a warning? Well, because they are hugely biased, these metrics. And what do I mean by that? They're biased against people from certain demographic groups, and they're also biased in many ways against people who work in different fields. That's shown here on this graph. So along the x-axis, we have different search tools which calculate H-index, so Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar. The colour bars here are for different subject areas, so humanities through to life sciences, as you can see here. And the H-index for a given researcher at a similar career stage is shown on the y-axis in here. So you can firstly see the obvious thing is that, you know, a humanities person of an equivalent career stage to somebody in a STEM discipline is lower. Okay, so they typically have lower H-indices. Why is that? Well, one reason is because humanities scholars maybe value books more, or societal engagement, or more directly translational work, whereas STEM may be more hardwired into you've published in this journal and you've been cited this many times, and that's how we're measuring and rewarding people in these disciplines. The other difference is the variability between the search tools. So between Web of Science all the way through to Google Scholar, you can see there's actually like a 4-fold increase in Google Scholar, and that's because of the way Google Scholar indexes things. It indexes a broader range of things than Web of Science, including things like conference abstracts and so forth. So there's a general warning there when we're trying to compare people between fields. That's the main message really of this slide, because if there are general fellowship calls, either by an institution or by a funder, we need to make sure that we are looking at those researchers through the appropriate lens and not comparing between fields which have clearly very different citation behaviours. Another really well documented phenomenon is the gender bias in metrics, and this is highlighted here when we look at self-citations, and it's pretty obvious where this is going to go. Men self-cite more than women. So these kind of the self-citation rates across these different fields on the y-axis higher with these brown bars than the blue bars, which are self-citation rates for women. And so again, if we're comparing people even within fields, we need to be aware that things like their H index may be impacted because of their gender identity. So there's and there's a paper which came out on preprints.org last week, which was basically around this exact point, actually, but looking at it through the lens of race and ethnicity rather than gender. But I think one thing I want you to take away from this talk is a lot of the things I've learned about metrics speak to very fundamental equality, diversity and inclusion points, right? So these are measures which discriminate against certain people who aren't the peak of the distribution, shall we say, or in the dominant demographic group in academia, and therefore they are penalised and are less likely to get promoted or to get positions. And we know that already, right, by looking at academia. And this just kind of hammers home the same point again, really. So again, a number of disciplines along the x-axis in here, H indexes for equivalent researchers along the y-axis in here, and these bars are showing the spread for these different disciplines. And you can see there's big field variability again in here. This is something which kind of terrifies me, is and it's kind of maybe the apex of how worrying all of this is that formally, as stated on this slide, or informally in our minds, we have an idea what a good H index would be for people in certain career stages. So this table is incredible, really. If you've got H index of 20 through to 90, and you compare that to the number of years in career as a scientist, so this notion of scientific age, this is how we characterize you. You're successful if you have an H index of 20 years after you've kind of finished your PhD. You're successful, you're outstanding, or you're truly unique if you have a H index of 60 only 20 years afterwards. And we just, the thing is, like, we just looked at the last slide where we saw all these massively different citation behaviours between fields. It's just complete nonsense. But, fundamentally, this is true, right? So when I got promoted at Imperial College, I got informally told, although the Richardson review at Imperial College sort of like codified against this, that a good, if you want to become a senior lecturer, you need a H index of 20. If you want to get a readership, you needed 14. If you wanted a professorship, it was 50, I think it was. And it took into account nothing else about your contributions to Imperial College or as a scientist more broadly. So it was all crystallized around essentially citation behaviors of others and the work you produce. So why do, just a light-hearted moment, and this idea that, citations can be gender biased, they can be driven by inappropriate self-citation behavior. I love these cartoons. So, there's a senior scientist on the right here and a junior scientist on the left. And it says, "It is a bad paper, and I, as a reviewer, I should reject it, but it cites 5 of my M papers." And some of you on the call may have seen this before, right? Again, the senior scientist on the right and another scientist on the left. I'm not interested in what the paper is about, Dr. Jones. I just want you to put me on the authors list. So, I just want you to put me on there because it's just another kind of pebble in the bucket. So when, my H index is being calculated, it might look better for me. Why some very senior scientist cares about this rather than just like looking after the junior scientist, I don't know. This senior scientist on the right here, yes, your paper seems to have lots of citations, but I've checked. they're all self-citations. So, you know, going back to that slide earlier on about how you can pump your rookie numbers, if you will, by self-citing, and then, you know, I'll give you a cookie if you cite my paper. So there's all sorts of questionable behaviour that is kind of well known, and I've seen amongst academics, which we need to talk about, make people aware are happening, and try and remove from academic practice. You know, just a couple of last slides on metrics and finishing this kind of discussion around the H index. So this is an interesting graph which is looking at basically H index changed by time for different researchers, right? So 3 researchers in here, A, B, and C, and it's about the stories that are contained in these plots. Okay, so you know, if we want to use these metrics to tell any sort of story rather than saying you're good, you're bad, it's actually about why these plots look like they do. So let's take this researcher here, who's obviously, let's say, the oldest researcher, or at least the most experienced. You can see they accumulated citations through time. Their H index increased, and then it flatlines, if you will, for about 10 years. So why is that? That might be because that researcher was moving into a new field, they were developing a new lab, they maybe had caring responsibilities. The richness of human life is captured in some ways in these metrics, but are they being identified and correctly controlled for by these metrics? So, you know, what's the story in here? Then clearly in 2005, they then started accumulating citations at a rate comparable to the early stage of their career. There's this person here who has a H index which is overall higher than, so C is overall higher than B in 2011, and they've been accumulating citations, and their influence apparently has been growing at a faster rate, uninterrupted, than researcher A. So if we were to compare these 2 researchers, what would we take from this? They've been active at different times. Maybe we're not looking at the story which is told in this period where the H indexes are kind of similar. Do we allow the people we work with and the people we're assessing to communicate that story to us through a narrative which builds on just these metrics alone? And I think the Royal Society have done some really good work around this with their researcher assessment. I can't remember if it's called a research assessment portfolio. I can post a link later on, but that's a very interesting idea, that you can narrate what's happened to you and what skills are kind of contained in these particular research outputs. Because remember, papers are only just one type of research output, and I know that the RIOT community know this more than anybody else. What I also love about H indexes as well is, you know, it's one of those things that can keep increasing as you die. So if I die tomorrow, people can still keep citing my paper. So theoretically, I'm a better scientist after I died, up to the total number of papers, right? So I could probably top out a H index of 200, right? And you know, that would all be most of that would be accumulated after I'd passed away. And just to, like I said, I'd come back to this later on. This was a data plot that I came up with a couple of years ago with the help of a few other people. I need to go back and replot this, but this is going to this idea of stories in raw data. So this is my, this was 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, when, you know, my metrics as H indexes for the different tools are shown at the bottom. Here, these are the different papers through time. You see this highly skewed distribution. There's a paper here which is number 1, which at that time was cited like 500 and something times. So, you know, that's this big key post-conference review paper in a journal with a modest impact factor. Everybody cited it because they were basically lazy. Whenever they talked about faults and fractures, they cited Faulkner et al. Is it a groundbreaking piece of work? No. Is it particularly in depth, really, in terms of what it does? Not really, but it kind of just looks like it's hugely influential, when I actually would argue it isn't. You know, here's a paper which was the first one I ever wrote. Oh, actually, this is one that I wrote during my PhD with my PhD supervisor. Been cited, you know, quite a lot of times. Again, in a paper journal with a modest impact factor. This was a big review paper written only a few years ago, really, by a PhD student, and that's just happened to land in a field which was very, very into a field which was quite large, who were working on these things called cliniforms. So there was a large pool of people to cite that paper, and that community was growing very quickly. So lots of people were citing this review paper of Stefano's. So, you know, in a big impact factor journal, the reason that journal's got a high impact factor, of course, is because it's Earth Science Reviews. So people often cite it as a go-to journal when they're getting into a field, even if the papers in there, I would argue, are not particularly rigorous, robust, or novel. And they probably don't need to be novel. This is the first ever paper I wrote in 2002, back in the Jurassic, in a journal with a modest impact factor, but I'm pleased about that. This was my first ever paper here, number 5. It had about 34 citations when we did this in a moderate, this from my field is high in terms of impact factor is 5. This journal now has an impact factor of 4.3. But this paper's only been cited a modest amount of times, and that's because it's quite esoteric, and the 3 reviewers really liked it because they were working in this similar esoteric field to me, and nobody else was. So this paper's accumulated a few citations. So it goes back to this point I made earlier on, as an early career researcher, which I sort of was more so at this time when this paper came out, I was happy to get it in this journal, but it didn't really do much, particularly that particular paper. And this is the paper I'm most proud of, and you can sort of ask me why later on. This is the paper which sort of sits in the middling zone in a modest journal, but this paper sort of defines a lot of who I am today in terms of how I approach my research. So why do we use all these metrics? Well, it's because we're busy, okay? The argument that often comes back to us is we don't have time to go and actually read the papers or read these narrative descriptions of what people's contributions is. And we saw this, I think, yesterday in the Times Higher Education supplement, if you didn't see it, but somebody proposed that REF, the Research Excellence Framework, could be dismissed, and we could just base it all around metrics. So we just pour all the papers into a machine, we turn the handle based on the journal impact factors and a few other things, and then it will just spit out which are the best universities. I mean, you can imagine. Yeah, we don't have time to kind of relax and sit down and look at papers and revel in what's in there, beyond simply this number suggests this paper is really good. And this logically, hopefully now for you, sieges into the last bit of the talk, which is about preprints. It's the idea that we could go and assess the quality, quote unquote, of work for ourselves without having to have it implied to us by the impact factor of the journal the work comes out in. And preprints are obviously one of the purest forms of that. It's where we show work which hasn't been peer reviewed, isn't attached to a journal yet, and we engage in that science. So now for something completely different, preprints. So what are preprints? So preprints, for those of you on the call who don't know what they are, I think the RIOT community probably are slightly more aware than most, but I'll still briefly go through what they are. As an author on the left-hand side here, we submit the paper to the editor. The editor may reject that paper. Certain journals have very high rejection rates of around 80%. Some are significantly lower, but they may get what we call desk rejected. The paper then goes out to review. It then accumulates a number of different reviews from a number of different reviewers. The editor then gets their reviews, makes a post-review decision whether to accept or reject your paper, at which stage maybe half of the papers get rejected. And then we go through this period where then a number of papers that are accepted then have a number of different minor checks, and then eventually they come out and are published at the right-hand side here. Those papers are then often paywalled, be they in print or on the web, so you have to have a subscription to access them. Or you can make a copy freely available. Sometimes at the proof stage, it comes back to you as an author. So, this time frame can vary from anything. I think the shortest I've ever had is 3 months. The longest I've had is 2.5 years. This is for a number of reasons, not least because of editorial slowness, reviewer slowness, technical issues when the paper's being produced. Okay, so this timescale can vary. And what's a preprint? A preprint is an unpublished manuscript yet to be certified by peer review. That's a description taken from ASUP Bio. And this is the idea that the manuscript goes in at the same time you submit to the journal. You also submit to a preprint server. And at that point, the preprint is then accessible and accessible by the broader scientific community who can give you feedback on the work that helps you improve it or otherwise. And also it kind of short circuits some of the time issues highlighted on the past slide. And then, this journal submission step can still be quite long, but at least the preprint gets the work out there. So preprints are not new, started in 1991 for rapid communication and science, covered these fields as shown here in the second bullet point, and archive has grown massively. When I first put this slide together, it was looking at over 1 million total submissions, over 1 billion total downloads, 100,000 publications per year, several millions of downloads per month. So clearly these communities were benefiting from and accessing and utilising preprints as a mechanism to communicate their work. And you can see the growth through time. So they're not new. There's different fields coming into this, so I'll come on to that in a moment. There's different models of preprint service. Some of them are journal-led, so Nature used to have Nature Proceedings. There's Peer.J. Some of them are funder-led, so Wellcome in here. Some of them are kind of individual, or I guess you would call them third-party organisations, so like BioArchive here in green, which is obviously, as you can see here, one of the fastest growing preprint service for the life and biomedical sciences. So yeah, there's different kind of model, and this talk is not to go through like preprint funding models and things, but it's just to say they're not new, and there's different types of preprint service. They are very widespread. Again, just to say it's not just about biomedical sciences. A lot of the discussion around preprints, the dangers and the questions and the problems all relate to, is it going to cause people to die from drinking too much red wine, because a preprint came out saying that if you drink 3 bottles of red wine a night, you'll live till you're 120, right? A lot of the discussions I see on social media and the meetings I've been in and the panels I've sat on are normally loaded. The dice are loaded towards the biomedical sciences. Yet there's all these other communities, as you can see here: humanities, physics, geoscience, agricultural sciences, as shown here. There's region-specific preprint service like Africa Archive. You know, there's other communities that can benefit from preprints, which maybe don't come with some of the jeopardy that is often talked about when we think about things like life and biomedical preprint service. They have support from publishers. Nature and Science and Elsevier have a number of different statements kind of supporting preprint use, encouraging preprint use, and saying your papers will not be rejected if they're preprinted, so they won't be considered prior publication. Elsevier, who some of you will know I have no particularly deep look for, they at least do have a very generous preprint policy where you can preprint at any time through the publication process. Support from funders. A number of funders will allow researchers to include preprints in their submissions. That's useful if you're moving into a new field and you want to show proof of concept of something that you've just worked on, and you want to show expertise or growing engagement with a particular field of research. You can include that preprint in your submission. I sat on a panel the other day for UKRI for the Future Leader Fellowship scheme, and about a third to almost a half of the interviews I sat in on had applicants who had preprints in their application packs or mentioned preprints in the interview. So it was really encouraging to see that in that case, a lot of early career scientists were seeing and engaging with the value of preprints. Support from universities, again, to support your promotion or application. You know, there's a number of different universities. There's a lot more than this now. And this is just the last few slides really about my experience with setting up Earth Archive. So I met Tom Narok and Bruce Caron, two guys I met on the internet, if you will, a few years ago. So in 2017, beginning of the summer of, and you know, Bruce was working with Earth Science Information Partners. Tom at that point was at Notre Dame universities, and I kind of had not really heard about preprints. So I ended up falling into a Slack group where they were being discussed, and I just thought, oh, this sounds like a great way of actually, you know, speeding up that process. Maybe this is where we could train early career researchers about how to identify good science, how to discuss science, and train reviewers and make reviews better as well. So I was just completely engaged with it from the moment I met these two. We were originally hosted by the Centre for Open Science, sitting on their Open Science Framework and supported by their Science Information Partners. And then last year, again, I'm not going to go into the history of Earth Archive in detail, but we moved to Janeway Systems Architecture, established at Birkbeck, and we are basically hosted by the University of California Digital Libraries. So, you know, that was a very, very exciting if stressful time last year when we were moving the preprint server around. This is what the preprint server looks like at the front, so it's just pretty basic. So what do we accept? A number of different things: research articles, review papers, you know, confirmatory studies, so-called null results, although I hate that term. No results are useless, they're always useful to somebody. Data description papers. What do we not accept? You know, kind of basically personal attacks. You know, we won't put up with racist and derogatory language. Commentaries and opinion pieces which are not backed up by scientific grounding. Posters, there's other places for those theses, again, I'm a big fan of publishing theses and making sure they get DOIs. There's services for that, Thesis Commons. We don't host those. So there's some things we do accept and some things we do not accept. I should add at this point, I don't know if it comes up later, but we actually assign DOIs upon submission to Earth Archive. So you get a time-stamped DOI with your submission. You're therefore establishing priority, which I'll come back to in one moment. Yeah, so we sign a DOI. We're not a journal. We're not working out whether your paper's any good or not. We're not looking at the scientific quality. We can remove papers if we see fraud or plagiarism is brought to our attention. And yeah, we take it very seriously. So just some data from this is actually from about a year ago, kind of over a year ago now, and we're actually putting together a talk for Goldschmidt in a few weeks' time with updated numbers. But this is just to show how we grew, okay? So this was, you know, the early growth phase of Earth Archive, and we saw this steady growth over the first year in terms of the papers that we were hosting. We're now at about 2,200 papers. So nice steady growth, and the split between postprints and preprints. Preprints being pure, preprints which have yet to go through the peer review process. Postprints are where we're archiving postprints. So these are accepted papers that our journal, which the authors want to share on Earth Archive as well as have hosted on their journal website. You know, we get 10 submissions a week. That's now about 20 submissions a week or a bit more. Actually, I think it's nearer 30 submissions a week. So it's kind of like growing nicely. And we're also on about 2,000 downloads per week now. So big bulge at the start, went down. And then as we get the language and people become more cognizant of what preprints are, more people are engaging with them. And geographically, we're seeing a spread. Now, this graph is really out of date because, or this chart, because, you know, when we had these data a few years back, you know, it was very US biased and European biased, but now we've seen a big growth in China as well, and we're not entirely sure why. And so ahead of Goldschmidt, we're trying to work out why we seem to have eventually cracked the Chinese market, which is a big body, and the Indonesian market, a big body of citing researchers. Likewise in India as well, and Africa, we were having large parts of the African continent. So anyway, lots of interesting things about how we develop Earth Archive going forward. So, you know, we say to people, consider submitting a preprint if you want to communicate your scientific findings without a delay. You want to get that work out there. You want everybody to have access to your work, because one way of circumventing paywalls is by preprinting, updating your preprint as it goes through peer review, such that your preprint essentially is the same as the ultimately accepted article. So it's effectively what we call the author accepted manuscript, the AAM, even if it's slightly different to the version of record, the fancy typeset paper that comes out. So you want to make your work open. And I think this goes to the RIOT core, right? It's this idea of doing science in the wild and in an open and transparent way. And one way we can replace the trust in science, if you will, which is a huge public issue as we've seen with COVID, is to ensure that science is done transparently. And I think preprints speak very clearly to the act of doing science in a transparent way, not only for our fellow academics, but also for the public at large. And also another reason is because you want feedback from your community, right? So one reason we go to conferences and we present work is because we want people to say, oh, you want to move that to the left or move that to the right, or maybe you want to add these up differently. And that allows us to improve our work and actually allows us to build a profile with the scientific community. And so I think they're a really good way of doing that. And I think James Heather's comment here has always stuck with me and basically has inspired me. You know, publishing preprints sends a message I want to send. They say I'm willing to talk. They say I want to participate in open culture. Please read my stuff. And I just love this idea that science is a collaborative endeavour, and you know, yeah, there's some competition, but you know, my argument is that that competition is net damaging, certainly for historically excluded groups. But actually having more collaborative endeavours in science is the way we will actually ultimately benefit ourselves as scientists, but also the broader public. You know, just some other comments in here. I won't go through all of them, but these are just a number of scientists saying, you know, that preprinting actually got their work out there straight away. This is a really cool comment here where somebody gave some feedback on something which was on bioRxiv. They went back and did all the analysis again, and they completely rewrote the paper. And then this is a story about somebody got a job offer from a preprint. Citation accumulation, so this is a really important point. Going back to the metrics in the first half of the talk, if you do care about metrics and you think that what I'm talking about is nonsense and you think I just want to get more metrics in my life and I want to have get a high H index as quickly as possible, one way to do that is by preprinting. Now these are old data, and if anybody has any new data on the call, I'd love to see it. But this black line here is the publication date of a particular paper, right? So this is the months through time. So this is a paper in the green curve that was pre-printed a year before the paper was ultimately published, and the y-axis here is showing the number of citations to that article. So you see that this paper in its preprint stage was already accumulating citations, and then it carried on after the publication date accumulating citations at a fairly constant rate. The red line here is for a paper which was not pre-printed, and what I can't quite work out from this graph is whether it was the same. I think it's just for a collection of different papers which were published in these journals but were not pre-printed, in this case on archive, and you can see that obviously none of them accumulated any citations up to the date they were published, and then they all accumulated citations at a lower rate than the paper that had been pre-printed. So again, that's because you're building community awareness and engagement with your work ahead of the formal publication, because you are effectively bringing forward that publication date by 12 months. Around 2/3 of studies, this is an awful pie chart, I didn't make it, but around 2/3 of studies here, this blue quadrant here, found that there's a citation advantage to pre-printed papers. And again, I think this is the last slide really. This idea that preprints allow us to innovate in peer review, right? So we have all these preprints out there on preprint servers. There's all these authors who are desperate to get feedback. There's all these early career scientists who want to learn how to review papers. There's all these scientists complaining about how crappy the paper reviews they are getting on, how horribly written they are, because we're not actually training people in many cases to review papers. Yet we have all these papers out there that people want feedback on. These things in here, pre-review, pre-lights, review commons, peer community in, are all methods by which preprints can be brought in into a curated space, if you will, and then have people reviewing them in a kind of semi-formal way, and those reviews then can be taken forward to the journals to support ultimate publication. And I really, really, really like this idea, and we're looking at this for Earth Archive. So I think that's the last slide. So hopefully that took you a whiz through some of my thoughts and feelings, and educated you a little bit about metrics use. So I also communicated to you some of the jeopardy involved in using those specific metrics, and then about how what preprints are and how useful they might be. So I will end there. Thank you. I'll stop sharing as well.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was very insightful, a lot of content there, and so I have to start off by apologising to our audience and to you, Chris. Unfortunately, the Q&A function isn't enabled, so I'd like to ask people to post. We've already started this, but post their questions, DM me on Twitter. We've got other means of communication, so it's at @riots_imperial, or even the RIOT Science Club on Twitter. And I've already got a load of questions that have come through, which is good, so we can kick off. I think the first thing that I'd like to say, I'm so glad that you came to do this talk, because I, as an early career researcher, certainly get really nervous about having my work and all that effort and all the people you engage with and the passion that you put into it distilled into these two metrics that may or may from a very early stage. We almost become indoctrinated to believe in this one article, this one output as the only currency to career success, and that makes me uncomfortable. And so it's nice to have somebody help, I suppose, see how we can perhaps move forwards and with less reliance upon those metrics, and maybe help us to critique and consider how we want to communicate and conduct science in a more open and progressive manner. We're all human, we have a story, we have our personal stories, but we also have our scientific story. And I think I would like to see in the future our way of a new way of assessing that. So I guess the first question really is, metrics, we always want to compare, we always want to have some form of metrics, but what would work? What would work?
Well, I think we need to be better at defining I think there's two things, right? I think we need to be better at defining our values as institutions and as people. Like, what do we want? Okay, and then if we're going to use metrics, use them towards that defined values system, rather than just saying, well, these are the metrics the whole sector uses, and therefore we're going to use that. And so that's one thing. I think we need to be better at defining values, and I think then certainly the increasing discourse around equality, diversity, and inclusion means I think that we're starting to value more things. I think that rabbit is out of the hat a little bit, and even in the 16 years I've been in academia. So I think that will naturally start to drive us away from using just blunt publication-based metrics into looking at the broader contributions of people, because we want people to contribute in teaching. We want them to contribute in knowledge exchange. We want them to contribute in making our workplaces safe and welcoming. So there's more things. And sure, we might go away and measure those with other metrics, but at least it dilutes it down, and I think democratizes to some level the selection process. The other thing I want to say is, if you're using metrics, and I think you said this in your introduction to my talk, I need you to tell me that you've used them before and they got you what you wanted. I need institutions to say, we use all these metrics and we have this demonstrably white, male, cis-abled, majority of our workforce, which we're unhappy with, we want to address, but we've got to use these metrics. I think that's the basis of my argument against them. And this preprint that came out last week speaks to this. And it does this very kind of interesting statistical analysis of looking at how racially biased, in that case, citations are against often people from the, what they call the global south. And so if you want to tackle inequality and you want racial justice, you need to be having conversations about the metrics you're using, right? So in that case, it sort of it's not beholden to me to give my boss a better thing to use. Although I've given him one, like, let's define some value systems, let's go and have these narrative assessments of researchers and their research. I think it's up to them to prove that the system they have at the moment is appropriate, beyond simply we don't have a lot of time, which is ultimately what the basis of the argument I get back is, I'm just really busy. And I think not being busy essentially is promoting, or at least the foundation of an ongoing racist and misogynistic environment.
Yeah, it goes without surprise, I suppose, that I would completely agree with that. I don't think being busy is an acceptable excuse when we're, I suppose, all that leads to is the perpetuation of a broken system that discriminates and prevents, in fact, a large majority, although they are a minority, about a majority of people from actually taking part. So, of course, you mentioned in your talk that there is a paper that you are most proud of, and I think it would be really interesting to hear what that paper is and why it is that you are most proud of it.
Yeah, so it's an obscure geology paper about something, right? That's not the important bit. The important thing is that it was the first time when I led a project where I had to integrate across a number of different data sets. So historically, I'd sort of worked with experts in all these different areas, and it was one of the times where I had to really go and teach myself something and bring it into another data space, which I felt like less or more confident in, and pulling that together. And it was really, honestly, one of the papers where I just felt like, oh, I can do this. I can use this different data. I can integrate across these data sets. I can understand how these sedimentary basins, in this case, behave by, if I push myself, I can do this. And it was just an incredibly, and it was like in the first 4 years or so of my, I was still a lecturer at Imperial College then, but it was just so seminal to me in shaping my scientific view and giving me confidence as a researcher. And yeah, the impact factor of that journal would take away from that confidence if I allowed it to do that, right? If I took nothing from that paper, apart from criticism that the paper was in that journal, it would have been useful. But I identified in that paper like something which really I felt is the foundation of what I try and do scientifically now.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to hear those sorts of stories so that we don't fall into the trap of looking to be defined by impact factor or H index. So thank you.
Yeah.
So a few questions. I've seen discussions on this on Twitter. You know, are they positive? Are they negative? You know, recently a reviewer said that you should list your preprints, but not papers in submission. You know,
yeah.
Have you got experience with what funders are looking for?
Yeah, so I've seen that thread because it comes up every Tuesday. About. So I think, you know, the most recent one was the original poster had a very good intention, but he just posted it in a terrible way, saying, "You early career scientists, you're being stupid if you don't put your preprints in," rather than saying "in prep" or something, right? And obviously the power resides with the PI or the supervisor and not with the early career scientist. So the way they phrased it was problematic. If possible, try and do it right, you know, and if you feel confident enough individually or as collective as a group of early career researchers in a group, go to your PI collectively and say, "Oh, we've heard about these things called preprints, we'd like to do this. Why are you sharing your work before it's published?" It's like, well, I'm applying for this fellowship, or I'm applying for this postdoc or this job outside of academia, and having this for them to see the work I did would be really useful. You know, try and you know, go forward individually or collectively to try and persuade the PI, and that won't always work. And in that case, those early career scientists may not be able to preprint. I've heard of cases where early career scientists have just said "screw you" to the PI because they're like, "You've screwed up my life enough already. I'm not letting you now kind of draw a line above this thing. I don't care. You can either be on this or not, and I don't care what your reference says, you know, because I've got no job in the next 6 months and I have to have this preprint out." I have heard cases of that, right? And you never want it to get to that, because you never want that friction or that tension to be there. Practically how I've seen it done, it's just in the standard way. It just says, like, so if you look at my CV, it says, you know, the author list, the paper, preprint available on Earth Archive with a hyperlink, and that's it. And then, you know, the reviewing panel can go and look at that paper, or the promotion panel can go and look at that and assess for themselves what they think the inherent quality of the work is.
Yeah, and I think it's really useful for early career researchers to consider how to have that conversation. And I think one of the things really about often doing open science is described as being detrimental to an early career researcher's career, and I think I'm sure that is the case. In other ways, and you raised it with the senior scientist. You know, why are they more interested being an author on a paper than looking after the juniors?
Oops.
So reliant upon impact factor or their own H index.
Yeah, sorry, you dropped out for a moment there just before you got to the last bit. So I think you were saying about the open science principles, and then the senior scientists being, just that last bit I missed, the senior scientists being hesitant about it.
Yeah, they're hesitant about it because they're also in competition, I suppose, using those same metrics and wanting to get it. Yeah. You know, their career was reliant upon it also. Yeah,
no, absolutely, and that tension's real. You know, there's this idea amongst, you know, sometimes, which kind of winds me up, PhD students or postdocs think as soon as somebody becomes a permanent lecturer, their life is set, and it's the sunlit uplands and the road is paved with gold, and it's not, right. They've got families, they've got lives, they've got frictions at work. They're trying to progress themselves, and even if you come to somebody like me, who's a professor now, you know, there's still jeopardy for me in terms of developing my career. There's still things I want to do. There's still things I don't want to be put in my way because I've been gobby about preprints or open science principles, and that's just a decision I have to make as to, you know, what I value the most and who I'm willing to upset, right? But I think, yeah, that's true. And those senior PIs. What do I think about it? I think the good thing is that those conversations are going on more readily now. So we're seeing open science sessions at conferences. We have things like RIOT Club. We have we have institutions signing things like DORA. We have open data practices being hardwired into funding, right? So now it doesn't matter whether you're an open science advocate. I don't care. We're paying for this through Wellcome Trust or something. That data needs to be here because that is that's data derived from public funds, and therefore that data needs to be reworked. It needs to be interoperable. It needs to add value in the future after you publish your paper in Nature. So that's the one thing I get quite excited about, is the fact that even in my time, I've seen these discussions happening more readily. So I'm not willing to say it's either going to happen or it's not. I just think some PIs are going to be forced into this space where, it's not that they're doing it through the goodness of their hearts. It's that they are actually doing it because they have to. But this speaks to a lot of EDI issues in general across the whole of academia. People are only good because it's worth it, not because they think they should be good.
Yeah, I suppose those things are now incentivized for them to engage with, and they have to also to be able to progress themselves. I think we mentioned we're running out of time, so I'll do one more question. You mentioned the Times Higher Education piece that came out yesterday about one of the proposals was to remove the ref and just use a citation-based assessment. The argument for that was that the ref is really time-consuming. Let's just put this in. Would you like to speak to that to wrap up?
Yeah, there's something hugely appealing about it, right? Because I absolutely hate ref. I think it drives a huge amount of problematic behaviour in practice. It takes up a lot of time. It makes us answerable emotionally to the general public, right? So it makes So yeah, if we could just pull the papers in a machine, turn the handle, and a number came out, that'd be awesome, right? Because then we could just all do it over on a Friday afternoon over a few drinks and some nibbles, and then it'll all be done by Monday morning. The problem is, as was taken apart by a lot of conversations on Twitter, was it will then drive research and hiring in certain spaces and not in others, because it will only, so it will curb the richness of academic institutions, because it's all then measured simply by metrics. So you remember those graphs I showed in my talk? Clearly you wouldn't bother with any social scientists or mathematicians, right? You'd go for high energy physicists and just build a building of them. And then just throw the bodies of the rest of the staff on the fire to keep the physicists warm. Yeah. So I think lots of people articulated the reasons not to do it better than I can. But there is something very appealing about how might we make ref better. And I don't know what to say. I mean, I think there was a couple of replies which were just along the lines of the only way we'd make it better is by just burning it. And ultimately, I can't move myself yet from that position to certainly not to a metrics-based mode of assessment. Do I like what we have already? Absolutely not. So I mean, I don't know. The best thing I can think about ref is, again, this dilution idea. Let's stop atomizing just the publications as the measure of how good we are. We have TEF, we have KEF. Can we do something which is a bit more of a holistic view of what universities are about, what we want to achieve as institutions, what our values are, what our mission is as civic entities, and then build a framework to assess from there? And obviously metrics might still come up in bits of that, but I think that would make me feel a little more comfortable, is if we did it in a broader way. Because the thing is, a load of people said this on Twitter yesterday, if you put all the papers into this machine that spits out a number, I think we'll get the same result, right? Which actually, if we did, then maybe it's a good thing, right? Because we just get the same result, which basically means that Oxford, Cambridge and us, or, I won't say us, but Imperial College, finish in the top 3, and we'll just get, and then LSE and King's or wherever else, right? Just get it over and done with. Just put all those numbers in. Just let's get the same result, and then we can all get on with our lives.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? When something's being proposed, I mean, as a time saving, you've got to think, well, right, okay, if it's more efficient to get the same result, then let's just go for it. But it doesn't change the fact that what we were doing was totally absurd.
No, exactly. I mean, and my concern is that we will end up looking at kind of hip but in vogue science with high And, you know, a lot of those citation metrics obviously talk to what I think I referred to as the citation pool, right? It's the number of people working in an area which ultimately dictates to some degree the number of citations that are available to you as a researcher to a paper. So if you work in these obscure areas like I do, like salt tectonics, right? The guy who basically established that as a science, and he passed away a few years ago, but he knew everything about it. He established that. His H index was like 34 or something, and he died when he was like 70. And you know, because there was a few people doing some really important work on a really important topic, but there was a few people.
Yeah. So it just doesn't work really as not a measure of the value or the contribution of that scientific work.
Yeah.
That has been brilliant. We are very over time.
Sorry, yeah.
No, it's so helpful. It's great to have somebody come and speak about this. I still think impact factors and H indexes, every time they get explained to me, the maths behind them, it still gets lost, and I just think it's some black magic. And I don't like the idea of my work being distilled into just these two numbers. And it's just nice to be able to have someone come and speak to us about how we can do things a little bit differently, working within the system that we're in. So thank you. I have one announcement to make, is that a similar talk is being held tomorrow by David Colquhoun. He's Metrics for Evaluation of Scientific Output and Other Pseudoscience. We've shared it on Twitter, so for people who are interested to keep the conversation going, that's happening. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Apologies that the Q&A wasn't live, but we've overcome it with a bit of Twitter. So thank you very much.
Nice to see you all. Bye.